Nick Wright with Zachary Fillingham of Geopoliticalmonitor.com. And today we're going to discuss Canada's upcoming general election, which is going to take place in Canada, obviously, before October 21st, 2019. So Zach, tell us a little bit about this upcoming election, what some of the main issues are, and how this will have an impact geopolitically on international affairs and politics.
Okay, well, a few issues that have been percolating in Canada might have appeared on everybody's radar lately. One big one is the ongoing spat with China, which has to do with the arrest of Huawei's Meng Wanzhou, the daughter of the founder and CEO of Huawei, at the behest of the American government, which is filing charges to do with averting the sanctions, the Iranian sanction regime. Huawei stands accused of setting up front companies, and basically intentionally circumventing U.S. sanctions. So that is the issue that is trending lately. And, when it initially broke out, I would have said that maybe by the time the general election hits, this would have simmered down a little bit. But I don't know, the way that it is playing in the headlines of late, one kind of gets the idea that it will still be a major issue when campaigning starts to ramp up. Of course, as Nick mentioned, we don't know exactly when in 2019 the election will be. But
and Zach, do you think the different political parties will take a different position on this issue, or will there be pretty consistent messaging across the political spectrum in Canada?
I think there's an opportunity for some diversity of views in the Canadian political establishment, particularly the Conservative Party trying to take a different view from the Trudeau government. But I think some of the sound bites that have come out lately, like for example, one this week that the Chinese ambassador to Canada warning about consequences if Canada decides or chooses to ban Huawei equipment from its 5G network. That definitely is not affording much opportunity for any Canadian political parties to step in with a different view, because basically it is, it's creating no space for any politician to back down, because it's going to be widely perceived as backing down to Chinese bullying. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see this is an ongoing. So according to the Trudeau government, the review of the 5G, the security implications of the 5G network, and whether or not Huawei and presumably ZTE could be involved in the Canadian network, because if you don't know, these companies are accused of having high-level contacts with the Chinese government, and by Chinese law, Chinese companies need to, cooperate with national intelligence services to a certain degree. We don't know.
Now, Zach, as far as I understand it, there have been 2 Canadians that have been arrested on charges of espionage. Also in the news, there's been a story of a Canadian sentenced to death for drug smuggling in China. Are these clearly acts of retaliation in relation to the Canadian arrest? Is there any uncertainty or ambiguity around whether or not it's in fact retaliation? And additionally, are there any steps that have been taken by the Chinese government beyond those 3 incidences that are likely instances of retaliation for the Canadian arrest?
I think it's pretty clear that they're acts of retaliation. Obviously, you won't get an admission from the Chinese side, because the implication is that their legal system can be gamed. But I think the most obvious indication is the death sentence for drug trafficking, where basically the appeal went through without new evidence. That's one thing, and the other thing is that the Chinese government made the rare decision to allow foreign media into the courtroom. So obviously they're trying to send a message. So we don't know, as pulling it back to the election, we don't know how this is going to play out because we don't know how this is going to be resolved. So I personally, as it stands right now, I think there's a high possibility that it's still there percolating when the campaign really starts in 2019. And it might actually come to be an important issue. I mean, like the way that the I'd say if you're talking about different political views or different political parties taking potential contrary views to the Trudeau government, depending on how that 5G review plays out, like whether Huawei is banned or not, that might open the door for some contrary views, and it might sort of elevate to the top of the debate.
Now, in the US, of course, there's been a trade dispute with China for some time. Could this likely be the start of a similar dispute between Canada and the US? And if so, what, if any, impact do you think that might have on Canada's longer term plans to build a pipeline from Alberta to Canada's west coast to potentially start selling petroleum to China?
Well, this sort of leads into another major issue in the Canadian election. And it's something that's covered in the Outlook series on the website. And that is basically Canada's energy policy. And more specifically, its pipeline policy. This is for any Canadian knows that this has been a hot button issue for a long time. And recent events surrounding the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which was originally advanced by Kinder Morgan, but was purchased by the Canadian government, the federal government, earlier this year. So in an effort to get the pipeline built, if you go according to the Trudeau government, because there's a bit of a regional disparity in Canada between the central and western provinces, well, I guess the western provinces and central Canada, Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada, because the oil and gas industry is much more economically important for the western provinces. Thus, the pipeline issue is much more politically important for the western provinces. As it stands right now, Canadian oil is rather climate averse to extract. It takes more CO2 than, say, shallow oil in Saudi Arabia. And right now, it's not very well served by pipelines. So often, Canadian producers need to sell it at a substantial discount to get it to market. So the Trans Mountain Pipeline was supposed to solve that by creating an export route from Edmonton in Alberta all the way to Burnaby, BC, which would allow for export via the Pacific, as you said, and allow for the export of Canadian oil to China. Now, this has also become an election issue because just right after the Canadian government purchased the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the pipeline's construction was put on hold because of a judicial appeal, which found that not enough consultations had taken place between First Nations groups and the pipeline builder. So now those consultations are taking place again, and it's an open question whether the pipeline will actually be built as per usual, and now it will become an electoral issue.
And Zac, given that Saudi Arabia has cut oil prices internationally, resulting in a drop in prices globally, what's the thinking in terms of continuing to develop Canada's tar sands, building the pipeline, if there's no clear indication that that policy will change? Will at any time Canadian oil from the oil sands be competitive with the current price of gas, which presumably is going to stay the same, at least for so long as Saudi Arabia continues to sell its oil at the price that it does?
I think it's hard to say. You speak to one of the central controversies of the issue, the question of whether that money is well spent basically developing the pipeline infrastructure for pre-existing quote unquote dirty oil and gas industry, or whether it's going to become basically wasted sunk costs given climate change and the rise of new renewable energy technologies. While I can't speak to that, and obviously we're going to see that play out in the election in Canada for sure on both sides. Um, but I can say, I mean, for one, Trudeau's approach has been to sort of straddle the line. On one side, he's advanced the carbon tax, which will also be another electoral issue. And on the other hand, he's tried to address these concerns somewhat by making sure that the Trans Mountain pipeline gets built. He's failed, but I think that was the original strategy. Um, so I do know that I think it takes about I don't remember the exact figure. I think it takes about $100 ish per barrel price for Canadian bitumen to be economically advantageous. But you know, it in a sense it doesn't really matter whether or not it is economically viable in a sort of macro sense. What matters is if it isn't economically viable, what's the alternative? What's the alternative plan? How are you going to fill the gap in those provincial economies? Because until you have some sort of compelling replacement to what the oil and gas industry is presently in these provinces, it's going to continue to be a divisive, hot button issue in Canadian politics.
And of course, the Green Party of Canada's position, which I'm a two-time candidate in past elections, would say, why spend this enormous amount of money on a high-risk pipeline and tar sands development with significant detriment to the environment when such fund could be used to be put into a green economy, renewable energy, etc. So it's definitely an interesting issue. And I think something that's of note is the seeming paradox in the Liberal government policy between wanting to proceed with the pipelines, but at the same time touting an environmental platform that would see the implementation of a carbon tax across the country. So, Zac, I don't really expect an answer, but but perhaps you could explain your thoughts on how it makes any sense that the government would both be proceeding with the pipeline and the development of the tar sands, while at the same time positioning itself as being concerned about Canada's carbon output and trying to rein that in with a carbon tax. The policies to me seem completely contradictory.
Yeah. Well, I think it's just, that's a bit of, dissidence from the fact we're living in a bit of a post-sense political climate.
The BC gets the carbon tax and Alberta gets the pipeline?
Well, I mean, I think that it's like basically the political strategy behind the plan is obvious, right? Like the Liberal government's trying to draw from both pots, like draw from both potential reservoirs of electoral support. So yeah, basically in an ideological sense, I think you're right. It ends up somewhat incoherent, but they're probably doing it by polling numbers and hoping to pull enough support in the Western provinces to basically win. And also, I mean, the original thrust of the carbon tax was to alleviate some of these economic concerns, right? Like, rightly or wrongly, the money that comes in, depending on the provincial scheme, because the different provinces have different approaches and different ways that they spend the money. Like, for example, BC puts it right back into tax breaks. Ontario, pre-conservative Ontario, had a sort of robust, system, cap and trade system. But the idea of the carbon tax, in theory, would be that you collect this revenue, and the revenue allows you to build the green economy that will eventually negate these dirty industries. That's the theory.
Although leaked lobbying reports suggest that there's every indication that Alberta will put its carbon tax money back into the oil industry, which is interesting.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, I mean that's not terribly surprising, right? Like, I mean, if you watch the Raptors game on television, you'll get basically anti-Saudi Arabia commercials funded by the government of Alberta. Um, so maybe that's where the carbon tax money is going to. But
And
um,
Zach, lastly, Canada's economy. Tell us a bit about that. Where do things currently stand? Where are they headed, and what impact, if any, will the situation economically have on the upcoming election?
Well, I think like the Trudeau government's benefited from sort of a global upward trend, or at least the upward trend in the United States over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, it might be, or unfortunately for the Trudeau government, they might be a victim of some bad timing in terms of global economic headwinds. We know that broadly speaking, across the developed world, economic growth forecasts are being trimmed back. So we might see a slowdown in the Canadian economy in 2019, and depending on the extent of that slowdown and how it plays out, it could well influence and impact the Liberal Party's electoral fortunes. And another thing that might play big in the campaign is the fact that the Trudeau government, if you recall back in 2015, was actually pretty forthright about the fact that it was planning on running deficits. It was one of the few, at the time, it was one of the fewer political parties that was actually embracing deficits and expansive fiscal policy in order to stimulate the government. And back then, there was a bit more of an austerity trend in the world, in the Western world. But they also, back in 2015, promised that by the time we got to the next election, they would have balanced the budget. And that is patently not the case, as the 2018-19 deficit's expected to come in around 18 billion. So these issues might also come up as, put the Liberals on the defensive in the campaign.
And Zach, realistically, is there any likelihood that the Liberals won't win another election? The Conservative
Oh, I
Party
think,
appears, from my perspective, not to have a strong or well-known leader. The NDP is in shambles, and there's no indication that that will change. What's the likelihood
yeah.
that either party could come around and have an impact on the Liberals' success in the upcoming election?
I think there's a pretty good possibility that like I wouldn't say it's likely, but there's definitely a good possibility that the Conservatives could win if like polls are to be believed. They've been narrowing the gap with the Liberal Party over the last 6 months or so. There have been some small periods where they've been pulling up around the same level, if not slightly ahead of the Liberals. So, I mean, it's going to be difficult for them because their path to victory should go through Quebec, and it doesn't look good for them in Quebec as per usual. And also, as you said, the NDP has not been doing so well, and as pointed out in the article, basically a strong showing for the NDP is usually bad news for the Liberals. But I definitely don't think it should be discounted. It's not strong. It's definitely a possibility because, I mean, we're talking about an election that can happen before October. That's going to happen before October, and so much can happen between now and then. Yeah, it's really hard to say. So I think there's definitely a possibility.
Interesting. Well, Zach, thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on Canada's upcoming election that's anticipated to take place at some time in 2019 before October 21st. We'll definitely keep an eye on things as they develop. And to our listeners, you can check out our website at Geopoliticalmonitor.com to read more about this and other issues affecting international politics, foreign affairs, and geopolitics. Talk to you next time. Have a good one.